So, why do bad things happen supposedly at critical times of the moon? How does moon phase or the state of the moon, uh, lunar cycle, have any kind of effect on us at all? Well, in some of my past videos, we talked about connections between science and astrology and other kinds of lore. So if that's something that you want to explore more specifically, please review those videos and other provided material content online. But basically, what we're going to be doing here is we're going to be taking a look at what kinds of easy references and tools can you use to get a handle on when bad times might be coming up. You know, it's a handy thing to be able to have an inclination um, into the future as to trends. And if you could do that in a way that makes your life a bit better, you can anticipate problems, why not? So I'm just going to cover this really briefly. The connection between frame dragging and moon phase. But I wanted to say thank you to the team in the US that has been supporting a recent research project, the target of which is trying to determine any possible behavior cycling in predatory insect. So the idea is we want to try to figure out what the clock or cycle of things like feeding, breeding are, and do these cyclic activities of the insect clock to lunar phase or moon state. We've been observing this for a few months, and again, much thanks to the team in the US for their support on this. And so far, what we found is that this particular predatory insect seems to be clocking pretty well to moon cycles. So if you're one of our other members or viewers, the basic idea is that certain kinds of behavior, impulses, biological, emotional, mental state can be affected sometimes dramatically by changes in the moon's position in relation to Earth. So let's start off, and we're going to take a look at, in this video, what kinds of simple tools can you use to have an idea as to what's coming up, how do they work, what are some references. But let's start off with the basic idea first. So in physics we have this concept of frame dragging, which is basically the idea of this space-time curvature being created by an enormous mass. So we have a distortion of space. We're actually putting kind of like a compression on the density of space itself. But what's interesting about frame dragging is that if you take a look, for instance, just at this image, the image is made up of many frames. Each frame has a certain kind of quality to it. It has a different kind of an orientation, that's for sure. But imagine if a change in frame qualitatively might affect you in a very specific way. Some of those frames might feel good, some of them might not. It might be the degree of compression, it might be the orientation, it might be the ambient mix of particles and radiation of different types within that chunk or space or frame of reality. So what happens when the moon moves? Well, this is actually a probe, but imagine that if this was the moon, it's having an effect on the planet, like its very motion. It might be minute, but we see it strong enough to affect things on Earth, such as the tides. Since human beings and most organisms are mainly water, we're like walking bags of liquid crystals. So if you put enough pressure on the ocean, which is full of salt, water, liquid crystal, and it can change the tides of the sea, you can bet that it's going to have an effect on organic life in curious ways, which might result in changes in physical, emotional, mental state. So I'm going to recommend two books that you get because they're both really good. And there's different ways that the moon can affect us. So one is simply by its position. Um, so, this is why we have a higher intake into clinics of, mental patients on full moons. We also see like a higher incident rating in police reports being made. Certainly consumer behavior is largely governed by lunar-related impulses, but there's more to it than that, because what happens is with people and with organisms, there's often a kind of imprint that's made. And that imprint that gets made is kind of like an electronic circuit. And you carry that around inside your body. I've talked more about this kind of stuff on other videos, but basically just imagine that what's happening is that there is a picture energetically imprinted of the position of the moon in a body, your body, the body of a predatory insect, as to where the moon was when it reached a state of instantiation, or it's being kind of crystallized into existence. So that means that not only do we have the general effect of the moon's actual position, but we also have a relational effect where the current position of the actual moon is exerting an angular influence and force, generally across the surface of the planet, but also situationally across the internal structural mechanisms and constitution of people that carry their own lunar position in their tissue. And that would be related to something called transits. This is an excellent book. It's not the easiest thing to find. I know you can pick them up sometimes on places like eBay. I'm not sure if this is coming in super clear. It's called Moon Power. It sounds like a really cheesy title. The name of the author is a fellow named Mort Gale. This is an astounding book. It's very simple. It's quite old. The diagrams they look like they're literally hand-drawn, and they're black and white. But the contents in here is just astounding. And it affects different parts of biology, covers gravity cycles, gravity and moon phases, and it really describes an enormous amount of information that is practically useful, as in this is content that you can put to work as simple lists of instructions and understandings you didn't have before that make a difference. The moon in bad times. These are some of the subjects. There's those depressing moods, accidents by the moon, suicide by the moon, heart attacks and death following the longer tides. So that's pretty significant, and that's just a small chunk of that book. This is another one. It's called Phases of the Moon, A Guide to Evolving Human Nature by Marilyn Bustede and Dorothy Virgin. It's an excellent book, and this is actually based on what is his name? Not Rudyard Kipling. W.B. Yeats. So this is actually a strange, it's not a very big book, but it is a very strange way to organize understandings of the moon in relation to self. And I shouldn't say strange, I should say more like it's very specific qualitatively. So if you wanted to break behavior down into very specific archetypes, I mean, they've literally laid out about 29 different well-detailed archetypes. And so why am I saying this? Because if we go back to the idea of frame dragging, essentially this is a handbook as to part of what the qualities of the scene in the film strip is that you're watching. So if you were watching an old movie projector, each of the frames on the movie reel would be part of the scene. It changes slowly. And so what I'm saying is that these kinds of books and these kinds of resources give you a window from the perspective of the lunar archetype that we experience organismically as to what's actually playing out on the stage in that frame. In other words, the moon is part of larger macroscopic system. So as it moves, so does the surrounding terrain. There's qualities to that experience. So by understanding what's going on specifically with the moon and how it's affecting people, we can get a much better understanding as to the nature of the space-time frame that we're in. Why is that helpful? Well, if we knew that there were qualities of a certain frame where aggression or injury or upset might occur, and we could distinguish and catalog those types of frames, have an understanding of what the qualities of the frames, or a given days over the period of a typical lunar month meant, we might be better prepared in advance, to deal with them. So let's look at a couple of tools that we can use really simply. One of the things that we should be aware of is that hard phases of the moon tend to be the ones to be cautious of generally. So it's quarter moon, half moon, three-quarter moon, full moon, new moon. So whenever there's like a critical, significant quarter designation, that's when you want to generally be fairly alert. And so how do you know when that is? Well, we can come to, there's a bunch of links in the comments section of this video below, so you can access those. They contain some really handy information, and I'm going to be showing you what some of these resources are that you can access. So on this one here, we just see this is a calendar of the moon. It shows us the quarter waning, it shows us the sign that it's in, gives us other kinds of indications. But we can scroll through that and we can see the moon changing here. So waning crescent, then it comes to the first quarter, waning gibbous. Again, it shows the progression through the signs. There's the full moon. So this is something you can use to track on a regular daily basis what the moon state is. Now let's take a look at some other cool tools. This is a different one, Lunarium. It's a moon calendar. And it gives us glyphs or symbols representing important moon states. So we can use that to get a very quick overview of the month. And let's take a look. This is a table, moons ingress by sign, so a quick look up shows you the actual times. There's a lot more to understanding how the moon affects us. I'm not going to go into everything in this video. One of the things that you want to be aware of, for instance, is when the moon is called void of course. And void of course usually happens for a chunk of time on a given day. We're not going to cover that here. And we've also got, I really like this site. It's the lunarplanner.com. This guy has a monthly lunar calendar. He does a really great job, and he provides a lot of cool free information. And he has some excellent products that are worth checking out. So I suggest checking out this link as well, this lunarplanner.com. And he actually has some cool things. I definitely share a lot of the same ideas as this dude. He talks about basically how gravity affects the body and emotions. So that's kind of awesome. Okay. Now this is another important one. This is elsa.com. This is her Transit Watch Astrology calendar. And I like this because it doesn't just cover critical moon states, but she also does a breakdown of other significant things going on in the sky. Why is that important? Well, if you're doing things like the pest control project that we're working on, chances are probably the things you're going to notice the most will be, critical periods in the lunar cycle for sure. So when there's like a full moon, when there's like a new moon, but other things going on in the sky can really correspond to, say, like an uptick in, activity. This one here, for instance, this would be a bad time to try to use poison gas against insects. It probably wouldn't go well. So that takes a little bit more knowledge of what we have to get into describing all of this here. But it's a good reference because if you're new to using this kind of material, all you really have to do is look this up. If you want to know what one of these means, just take that little phrase, Sun square Neptune, put it in parenthesis, do a Google keyword search, and you can know what the energy of the day is in advance. But basically the same concept holds here where there's hard angles. So we've got something that's like a square, like Sun square Neptune, and when you've got an opposition, it's 180 degrees. So that would be probably a tough day. But that's a resource that's really super helpful. It helps. It's a good thing to use. Now I'm going to step you through a few other resources. On our website, there are some good links and content regarding the moon. This is a tool used in our group. It is not in the public domain. It was provided to me under strict conditions. I do not own the copyright of the software, and the person that designed the software, my understanding is they've pretty much disappeared. But it's amazing. This calendar does, or this calculator does something that nobody else that I know of does. And it does it with amazing accuracy. I've used this for over 10 years, and it's astounding. It's an absolutely amazing piece of software. In a synodic cycle, so past the normal lunar month, you've got basically 57 periods in that cycle, nodes. And what this moon phase calculator does is it actually calculates what it calls a meltdown. This is a great page. I'm going to include this on the video comments below. You should check it out. But basically what it does is it shows you the day right down to the time in minutes of when things are going to go sideways. When are those bad times of the moon going to occur? So that's very helpful. Now, also, let's see here. You can see relations between tidal forces and the effects in the body, like we talked about. And there's some notes here that you can read about that is relevant to our study. So I'm going to include those links in there as well. You do see changes in magnetic field and radio wave frequency effects during certain lunar positions, especially in relation to other activity going on in the solar system. Solar flares are a good example of that. I think that's pretty much it. That should give you a good, so this is another good tool to have, the geomagnetic state. We know that there is a correlation between volatile activity in the upper magnetic atmosphere and in the geomagnetic state on the planet with behavior. So this is free, and it's a pretty cool tool to use because you know that when there's a disturbance in the geomagnetic field, that it's going to often result in things going sideways. So that's another good thing to make use of. But that gives you a series of resources to take advantage of. I hope that's of help. Like I said, there's a lot more to it, but this gets you started. So what do? How do you begin? You want to become familiar. Excuse me. You want to become familiar with terminology related to the moon's influence. So waxing and waning. Gibbous moons, crescent moons. But just basically become aware as to the timing of it. When do the quarters of the moon happen? And that should really get you started in how to use the moon to get an idea as to what's coming up. I hope that helps.